The grave was not marked with stone. They did not do that here, in the settlement camps outside Veth-Dura. You scratched a name into a piece of scrap alloy if you had it, bent it into the frozen ground with your bare hands if you didn't, and you stepped back and hoped the wind didn't take it before morning. Kaelura had no alloy. She had only her hands, and they were bleeding by the time she finished pressing the iron-gray soil down over her mother's body. And the name she had carved into the dirt with her thumbnail was already starting to blur at the edges because it was raining. A thin, mean drizzle that the humans who governed Veth-Dura called weather, and the orcs who lived under their sky called something that had no translation. A word that meant specifically the sensation of being cold in a place that used to be warm. She knelt there for a long time. The camp around her went on with itself. Somewhere behind the row of prefab shelters, someone was cooking something that smelled of charred grain and fat, and the smell drifted to her, and her stomach answered it, and she hated herself for being hungry. Her mother had been in the ground less than 2 hours. Her mother, who had been 39 years old in human reckoning, though the orcs did not count years the same way, who had been given a course of velthamine 4 months ago by the processing clinic on the edge of Sector 9, and who had not been the same afterward, not in any way Kaelura could name precisely. Just gone, somehow, still breathing and eating and occasionally speaking, but gone from behind her eyes, the particular light that had lived there replaced by something flat and cooperative. Something that no longer argued with the intake nurses, no longer organized the older women in the camp to push back against the curfew ordinances, no longer hummed the grinding songs her own mother had taught her while she worked. A woman who had been remade into something easier. A woman who had eventually stopped eating and then stopped waking, and the clinic had called it a complication of existing conditions and closed the file. Kaelura was 17 years old in human reckoning. She pressed her palm flat against the blurred letters of her mother's name, and she made a promise. She did not say it aloud. She did not need to. In Orc tradition, what was left of Orc tradition, what had survived the resettlement and the processing clinics, and the 4 decades of velthamine distribution that the Dominion administration called a mental health initiative. A promise made at a grave with your bleeding hand in the dirt was not a social act. It was a structural one. It rewired something in the body. You could not unmake it any more than you could unbreak a bone. She promised that she would find the records. She promised that she would take them out. She promised that she would show them to everyone who had eyes. Then she stood up, and the rain came harder, and the name in the dirt washed away, and she walked back through the camp with her hands in her pockets, already thinking. The Dominion's administrative architecture for the resettlement territories operated on a system called the Horoscope Index, which was not, despite its name, anything mystical. It was a predictive compliance scoring system developed in the early 2040s by a Dominion bioethics contractor named Essen Vrail, who had since won 2 awards and retired comfortably to the northern provinces. The index assessed each registered Orc individual for what it termed sociopolitical volatility indicators, a metric that included things like attendance at unsanctioned gatherings, complaint filings with the processing clinics, any documented resistance to intake procedures, maternal lineage flags if your mother had been scored above a certain threshold. It then generated a number between 1 and 100. If your number crossed 72, you were automatically referred for a velthamine assessment. If your assessment confirmed what the index had already decided, you were prescribed. Kaelura's mother had scored 81. Kaelura had never been scored at all, because she had never been registered. Her mother had kept her out of the system with a combination of borrowed identities, strategic misdirection, and the particular stubborn genius of a woman who understood that the first act of resistance was to simply not exist where they were looking. She had been, in her way, a cartographer of invisibility. She had mapped the gaps in Dominion administrative coverage the way a navigator maps shoals, by knowing exactly where the rocks were and steering clean. Her daughter had inherited the map. Kaylura walked to the eastern edge of the camp, where the old water reclamation units had been decommissioned and left to rust, and crouched behind the largest one. She pulled out the thing her mother had pressed into her hands 3 weeks ago, when her mother had still been something like herself, when there had still been moments of surfacing, brief windows of the old sharpness before the Velthamine pulled her back under. A data wafer, thin as a fingernail, gray-green, the kind of industrial storage medium the Dominion clinics used for their internal records transfers. Her mother had not explained where she got it. She had just pressed it into her daughter's hand and said, in the low, even voice of someone choosing every word very carefully, "They keep the full prescribing records in the quarterly archive. Not the summary files, those are scrubbed. The archive. Sector 9, Sublevel 3, behind the Environmental Systems Panel, Access Node Delta 7. Your grandmother showed me. I never went in. You go in." That was the last coherent thing her mother had said to her. Kaylura turned the wafer over in her fingers. The archive, a sublevel of the Sector 9 processing clinic, a place she had never been, in a sector she was not registered to enter, using access protocols she did not yet have. She thought about this for a while with the methodical patience that was her only inheritance, her mother's gift to her, the ability to look at an impossible thing and not flinch from it but instead begin, quietly, to find its edges. She thought, I need 3 things: an ID that will pass the intake scanner, a route to sublevel 3 that doesn't go through the main corridor, and someone who knows what the archive records actually contain, so I know what I'm pulling when I get in there. She thought, I know where to start on all 3. The woman who called herself Dreva had been a Dominion Records administrator for 11 years before they found the copies she'd been making. She lived now in the camp's gray zone, the strip of tolerated semi-permanent settlement that the Dominion classified as pending relocation and never actually relocated, in a shelter that was half salvaged panel and half original structure, held together by the specific ingenuity of someone who had once been good at her job and now applied that skill to survival. She was human. She was the first human Kaylura had ever trusted, which was less a testament to Dreva's character and more a testament to what the Dominion had done to Kaylura's understanding of the category. She was also the only person in the gray zone who had ever read the raw horoscope index data. Kaylura came to her in the early morning when the camp was still and the intake drones hadn't started their first circuit. She didn't knock. You didn't knock in the gray zone. You stood in front of the door and waited to see if it opened, and if it didn't, you came back another time, and the repeated attempt itself communicated urgency. The door opened on the first try. Dreva looked at her for a moment without speaking, then stepped aside. Inside was warm in the way that scavenged heating elements are warm, unevenly in patches, the corners cold and the space near the power conduit almost uncomfortable. There were papers everywhere, printed on both sides, covered in Dreva's small, precise notations. There was a kettle on a makeshift surface. There was the particular smell of a space that had been lived in for a long time by a person who did not expect to be anywhere else. Your mother, Dreva said. It was not a question. 2 days ago. Dreva said nothing for a moment, then, sit down. Kaylura sat. Dreva made something hot and put it in front of her, and she drank it without tasting it. The data wafer, Kaylura said. She told you about it. 3 weeks ago. When she could still tell me things. Dreva sat across from her and folded her hands on the table, a gesture that Kaylura recognized as the gesture of someone who was about to say something they had been rehearsing. What she gave you is a read key for the quarterly archive. The archive contains the unredacted prescribing records, the full index scores, the referral criteria, the internal dosage memos, the projected compliance outcomes. Everything the public-facing records don't show. She paused. If you pull those records and get them out of the system and into circulation, you have evidence that the index was designed to target individuals with scores above a certain threshold, regardless of clinical need. That velthamine was prescribed as a behavioral management tool, not a treatment, that the clinics knew. Another pause, smaller, that your mother was not the only one. How many? Dreva looked at the table. The records I saw before I left this camp alone over the last 8 years, conservatively, 463 individuals. And this is one of 11 camps in this sector. Kaylura was quiet for a long time. The access node, she said finally. Delta 7, yes, I know the panel. I installed 3 of the seals myself when they were building the sublevel. Dreva looked at her steadily. You understand that if you're caught inside the system, they'll score you, immediately. And your number will be high. I know. And you're going. I promised. Dreva studied her for another moment, then reached into the stack of papers to her left and pulled out a slim rectangle of pressed composite, an ID chip, old design, pre-biometric, the kind that would pass the first-generation intake scanners still running in Sector 9's outer corridor. I've been holding this for 3 years, she said. I kept thinking there'd be a better use for it, a bigger play, something more organized. She slid it across the table. I think this is the right use. Kaylura picked it up. I need the route, she said. I'll draw it. Sublevel 3 of the Sector 9 processing clinic smelled of recycled air and old ozone, the particular atmosphere of a space that had been sealed and climate-controlled for years, and had slowly, imperceptibly, become a closed ecosystem of its own. The lights ran on a maintenance cycle, full brightness for 40 seconds, then 60% for the next 3 minutes, then 40 seconds of full brightness again, endlessly. Kaylura had timed it 3 times from the access shaft before she moved, counting under her breath in the rhythm her mother used to use for the grinding songs, 1 and 2 and, the beat steady even when the words were lost. The intake scanner had read Dreva's chip without hesitation. The outer corridor had been empty at the hour Dreva had specified. The shift change gap, 12 minutes between the end of the overnight run and the start of the morning audit cycle, a window Dreva had confirmed still existed because administrative systems built by the lowest contractor bid always contained the same structural laziness. The gaps that the people who designed them on paper never caught because they never had to live inside them. The environmental systems panel was where Dreva had said it would be. A gray-green rectangle flush with the wall, secured by a mechanical latch that the Dominion had not upgraded because mechanical latches did not show up on digital security logs as anomalies. Kaylura pressed it the way Dreva had shown her, left corner first, then right, then a sharp upward push, and it swung open on a channel that ran behind the wall's inner membrane, just wide enough to move through sideways, with a conduit of data cables running along the ceiling, and the access node itself mounted at shoulder height, a small gray terminal with a single interface port. She pressed the read wafer into the port. The terminal took 11 seconds to recognize the key. She counted them. 1 and 2 and the old rhythm, the grinding song beat. Then the screen lit and she was in. She had expected data. She had not expected the weight of it. The quarterly archive rendered in scrolling columns of case entries, each one a name or an intake number, each one a score, each one a prescription date and a dosage level, and a compliance outcome rating. She had brought a secondary storage chip in the lining of her jacket, pressed against her ribs where body heat would keep the adhesive from loosening, and she loaded the transfer protocol Dreva had written out for her in 3 sets of printed steps, each step's paper to be destroyed after reading. She began pulling the files. It took longer than she'd planned. The archive was larger than even Dreva had estimated. Not just this sector, she realized as the columns scrolled, but the full network, 17 sectors, the complete data set, updated quarterly, running back 14 years. She stood in the narrow service channel behind the environmental panel and read the names as they transferred, and she kept the count in her head because that was the only thing she could do for them now, the only act of witness available to her. and by the time the transfer completed her legs were shaking, and she had stopped counting because the number had become a thing she couldn't hold. She pulled the wafer. She pressed the panel shut. She walked back through the outer corridor and through the intake threshold and back out into the Sector 9 service lane, where the drizzle had started again, and the sky over Veth Dura was the particular shade of gray-orange it turned when the atmospheric processors were running above capacity, and she stood there for a moment with her hand inside her jacket, her palm flat against the storage chip, the names against her ribs, and she thought about her mother's voice singing in the dark of their shelter when she was small. And she walked. Dreva had a contact. She had always had a contact, which was, she told Kaylura without apology, why she had survived as long as she had. The contact was a human journalist named Selen Orvith, who worked for an independent transmission network that the Dominion had been trying to shut down for 6 years without quite managing it, because Orvith was careful in the way that people who understood systems were careful. Not reckless, not heroic, just persistently and infuriatingly present in the gaps the system left open. Orvith came to the gray zone on the 3rd evening after Kaylura returned. He was younger than she'd imagined from Dreva's description, with the particular quality of alertness that the overworked and under-resourced develop as a survival trait, and he looked at her for a long moment before saying anything, and what he finally said was, "You got the full archive. All 17 sectors. 14 years. He was quiet. "They're going to know it's gone," he said. "The wafer leaves a read signature." "I know. They'll score you. If they find you, they'll prescribe you immediately. No assessment, straight to maximum dose. They'll call it an emergency mental health intervention." Kaylura looked at him. "I know," she said again, in exactly the same voice with exactly the same steadiness, and something shifted in his expression, some recalibration, she thought, some adjustment in whatever estimate he had arrived with, and he nodded. "How long do I need?" he asked. "Until it's out, until it can't be recalled." 48 hours. If I have 48 hours, I can get it to the external relay and it goes wide. After that, they can't contain it." "Then you have 48 hours, she said. "And I need to not be findable for 48 hours. Dreva, who had been sitting to the side of this conversation with the focused stillness of someone who has been organizing things for a long time and knows when to let the thing organize itself, said, "I know where." The place Dreva knew was the decommissioned reclamation unit, the same one Kaylura had crouched behind on the night of her mother's burial, the large rusted cylinder at the camp's eastern edge, which was not actually fully decommissioned, but was listed as such in the camp's maintenance registry, because the maintenance administrator had been bribed into the listing by a series of favors over several years, and which still ran a low-level humidity cycle that kept its interior above freezing and made it technically habitable in the way that only people with no better options use the word habitable. Kaylura spent the 48 hours there. She slept in shifts. She ate the food Dreva passed her through the access panel, twice-heated grain paste in a sealed container, the same food that smelled of char and fat on the night she'd buried her mother, and she ate it now without flinching, because it was food and she needed to be functional, and there was no version of this that was helped by refusing to eat. She checked the storage chip against her ribs in a compulsive rhythm she recognized as anxiety manifesting physically, and allowed herself the rhythm without judgment. She thought about the names. She thought about her mother's hands in the dirt, the way they'd looked in the last weeks, the velthamine doing what it was designed to do, smoothing out the resistance, rounding the edges of a woman who had been all useful sharp edges. On the second night, she let herself cry. She did it efficiently and without theater, the way her mother had taught her to do everything. You don't suppress it, her mother had said once. You just don't let it run longer than it needs to. It runs, it finishes. You go back to work. She cried and she stopped and she went back to thinking about the archive. On the morning of the 48th hour, Dreva's knock came on the panel. 323. The signal. Kaelura opened the hatch. Dreva's face in the gray dawn light was doing something complicated. Orvith got it to the relay, she said. 4 hours ago. It's in circulation now. External networks, 3 independent archives, 2 human rights monitoring bodies, the outer settlement's data commons. They can't take it back. Kaelura stood in the hatchway and breathed the cold outside air, which smelled of rain and the particular metallic edge of Veth Dura's industrial quarter, and was exactly as cold as she had left it. How bad is the response? She asked. They've issued a general security escalation for the camp sectors. Intake patrols doubled. They're calling it a data integrity incident. Dreva paused. They haven't named you. They don't know it's you yet. The wafer read came back registered to the old chip identity, which is documented as a Dominion ex-employee in the system. Me, technically. A small pause. I reported myself as the source. Kaelura looked at her. You shouldn't have done that. I should have done it 3 years ago, Dreva said. The chip was mine to deploy. This was the right deployment. She said it with the practical finality of someone who has made the calculation and is comfortable with the result. And Kaelura recognized that register. It was her mother's register, the voice her mother used when a decision was made and the making of it was finished. Some things translated across species perfectly. The response came in stages, and Kaelura watched it from the inside of the gray zone with the same methodical attention she gave everything. First, denial. The Dominion's Regional Communications Office issued a statement calling the archive data fabricated, the product of what they termed an organized misinformation campaign by anti-resettlement agitators with documented histories of administrative noncompliance. They named no one specifically. The statement was measured and confident, and arrived 14 hours after the data had been verified independently by the 2 human rights monitoring bodies, which meant the denial had been written before the verification was complete and had gone out anyway, which told Kaelura something about the kind of system she was dealing with, the kind that had decided the narrative before it looked at the facts, and then sent the narrative anyway because it had always worked before. Second, the counter-narrative. The Dominion Clinic in Sector 9 issued a supplementary statement explaining that the horoscope index was an evidence-based clinical tool developed in consultation with licensed practitioners, that velthamine was a thoroughly tested pharmacological agent with a strong safety profile, that the prescribing records had been taken out of context by individuals without the medical expertise to interpret them. The statement included 2 paragraphs about the mental health crisis in the resettlement territories and the genuine need for clinical intervention services, and the paragraphs were not wrong, exactly. There was a mental health crisis, genuine and serious, and it had been created in significant part by the conditions of the resettlement itself, and the clinics knew this, and the records Kaelura had pulled made clear that the clinics knew this and had prescribed velthamine anyway, as a management tool rather than a treatment, and the supplementary statement did not address this, and the monitoring bodies said so. Third, the internal fracture. On the 4th day after the data went wide, 3 Dominion Clinic administrators in Sectors 7, 12, and 14 issued separate statements confirming the archive's authenticity. One of them, a human woman named Pavitt Sorsun in Sector 12, said publicly that she had flagged concerns about the index's targeting criteria internally 4 years ago, and had been told the concerns were noted and would be reviewed, and had not been contacted again. Sorsun's statement was the one that moved something, not in the Dominion administration, which continued its measured confident denial, but in the human settlements outside the resettlement zones, where people who had not previously thought much about what happened in the camps read her words and recognized the particular texture of an institution protecting itself from its own record, a texture that humans recognized because they had built institutions that did it too. Kaelura read these developments in Dreva's shelter, on Dreva's battered terminal, while Dreva sat at the table and made careful notations, and occasionally said things like the monitoring bodies are pushing for a formal inquiry, and Orvith's second piece drops tomorrow, and 3 outer settlement councils have requested the full data set for their own review. Kaelura listened, and she thought about 463 names from this camp alone, and she thought about 17 sectors, and she thought about 14 years. "It's not enough yet," she said. "No," Dreva agreed. "Not yet, but it's started." They came for Dreva on the 6th day. Not for Kaelura. The chip read had led them to the registered identity, and the registered identity was Dreva, and the Dominion security apparatus had decided, reasonably, that a former records administrator with documented prior noncompliance was the most plausible source of the breach. They came in the early morning, 2 compliance officers and a clinic intake specialist, with a Section 14 administrative warrant that authorized an immediate assessment under the emergency mental health provision. Dreva had known they were coming. She had, in the quiet, methodical way that Kaelura was coming to understand as the woman's essential mode, prepared for it. She had sent a copy of everything she held, every notation, every piece of corroborating documentation she had accumulated over 3 years, to Orvith and to the monitoring bodies the night before. She had written a statement, clear and exact and without self-pity, describing her role in the disclosure and the evidence she possessed. She had made tea and left it on the table. She told Kaelura at 2 in the morning, sitting in the uneven warmth of the shelter, in a voice that was doing its best to be steady. "They're going to score me," she said. "I already know what number I'll get." Kaelura sat across from her and said nothing for a moment, because there was nothing that could be said that would change the thing, and she had learned from her mother that acknowledging the shape of something was sometimes more honest than trying to reframe it. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Nothing," Dreva said. "Everything you needed to do, you've done." A pause. "Everything I needed to do, I've done." Another pause, different in texture. "I need you to remember that I did it on purpose, that it was a choice." Kaelura looked at her. "I'll remember. And I need you to not be here when they come." She wasn't. Kaelura was at the eastern edge of the camp, at her mother's grave, when the compliance officers went through the gray zone. She could hear them distantly, the particular acoustics of official movement, the cadence of people who carry authority as a physical weight and deploy it accordingly. She crouched in the wet earth and pressed her palm flat against the place where her mother's name had been, where the rain had taken it but the ground still held the slight depression of where she'd pressed, and she thought, "I remember this." She thought, "I am not done." The Dominion inquiry was announced on the 9th day. Formal, structured, with a mandate that the monitoring bodies had spent 3 days negotiating into something with actual teeth, access to unredacted records, independent clinical review, a suspension of new velthamine prescriptions pending the review's findings. It was not justice, not yet, not in any form she could point to and name precisely, but it was the thing that justice required before it could arrive, the acknowledgement that the records existed and that what they showed had happened. On the 10th day, Orvith published the number. Not the number from this camp, not the sector number, the full number. 14 years, 17 sectors, every camp in the resettlement network. The number was not the one Dreva had given her, not 463. The number was larger by 2 orders of magnitude. It was a number that, once it was in circulation, changed the shape of the conversation in a way that was not reversible, because humans, whatever else they were, and they were many things, the Dominion no less than any of them, humans had a specific and powerful response to a number large enough to stop abstraction, to the number that made it impossible to look away. Kaelura was not there to see the response spread. She was already moving, because staying was the one thing she could not do. The inquiry would review the chip records, and the chip records would eventually reveal the access node read, and the access node read would eventually point somewhere other than Dreva, and when it did she needed to be somewhere other than findable. Her mother had taught her the map of the gaps. She was inside it now, moving through the spaces between administrative coverage, the places that didn't register, the gray zones between gray zones. She had the map. She had her mother's mind for it, the inherited instinct for the space between the rocks. She had the promise. 6 weeks later, in a small settlement 2 sectors east of Veth-Dura, in a room that smelled of cooking oil and damp concrete, Kaylura sat with 5 people she had never met before and read the formal findings of the independent clinical review, which had been published that morning. The review found that the horoscope index had been systematically applied to orc populations at thresholds significantly lower than clinical guidelines supported. It found that velthamine had been prescribed as a primary intervention in cases where the documented need was social and economic rather than clinical. It found that the prescribing records showed a consistent pattern across all 17 sectors. It found that the projected compliance outcomes cited in the internal memos were not clinical outcomes. It found, in the specific clean language of official inquiry, what the records had already shown, that what had been done knowingly and repeatedly, and to a number that was not an abstraction. One of the 5 people in the room, an older orc man named Verash who had lost his daughter to the velthamine cycle 7 years ago, and had been filing complaints with the processing clinics ever since, read the findings aloud in their original language first, and then in the camp's shared trade dialect, and then was quiet for a long time with the paper in his hands, and Kaylura watched him and thought about her mother's hands pressing the date a wafer into her palm, 3 weeks before the end. In one of the last windows of the old sharpness. Your grandmother showed me, her mother had said, I never went in, you go in. What now? Someone in the room asked. Kaylura looked at the findings in Verash's hands. She thought about Dreva, who was in the Sector 9 assessment facility and whose case was now part of the inquiry record, whose statement was in the public file, who had, by her own account, done what she needed to do and known the cost. She thought about Orvith, who was still publishing, who had not been stopped because stopping him now would be too visible. She thought about 463 names from one camp, and then the larger number, and then the names behind the number, the individual textures of people who had been smoothed and rounded by a system that needed them manageable. She thought about what her mother had sounded like, humming in the dark. Now, she said, we make them implement the findings. It was not a triumphant answer. There was nothing triumphant about it. It was the next step in a sequence that did not have a known end, the specific kind of work that orcs had been doing since the resettlement. Not the work of one large act, but the work of 10,000 small persistent ones, the grinding work, the work that didn't look like victory from the inside, but built toward it one entry at a time. Verash set the paper on the table. Right, he said. Outside, the rain had stopped. The particular gray-orange sky over the settlement's industrial quarter was lightening towards something that was not quite blue but was moving in that direction, and the atmospheric processors had dropped to their maintenance frequency, and the morning sounds of a camp coming to life were beginning, someone calling to someone else across the prefab lane, the smell of cooking from 3 shelters down, the particular unsilenced ordinariness of people who were still here, and still doing the things that living required. Kaylura stepped outside and stood in the lightening air. Her hands were not bleeding anymore. The cuts from the night of the burial had healed, the scars thin and pale against her green-gray skin, barely visible unless you looked for them. She looked at them for a moment, the map of that night, written into her palms, the small physical record of a promise made in the wet dirt, beside a name that the rain had taken. She remembered the name. She remembered all of them. She went back inside. The formal suspension of the horoscope index across all 17 sectors was announced 11 weeks after the inquiry findings. The announcement came from the Dominion's Regional Health Administration in language that was bureaucratic and carefully unapologetic and structured in every possible way to imply the decision was a considered policy evolution rather than a retreat under pressure, And it was all of those things and also what it was: a suspension. The index stopped running. The quarterly assessment cycles stopped. The automatic referral pipeline from index scores to velthamine prescriptions stopped. It was not a reversal of what had been done. Nothing would reverse what had been done. Kaylura understood this the way she understood the scar on her palm, not as a wound still healing, but as a record that would remain present and legible for the rest of her life. The monitoring bodies continued. The independent clinical review's follow-up process continued. The 3 outer settlement councils that had requested the full data set were conducting their own assessments. Verash had filed a formal complaint on behalf of 62 families from his camp, the first of what Orvith had confirmed would be hundreds of similar filings across the network. Dreva's case remained open inside the inquiry process, and her statement remained public, and the clinic intake specialist who had administered her assessment had been named in 3 separate complaint filings and was now subject to the inquiry's own review. Slow, complicated, full of reversals and delays and the particular friction of institutions being asked to account for themselves by the people they had been accountable to all along and had simply ignored. Kaylura was in her second settlement by then, the one that wouldn't be found, living in the gap the way her mother had taught her. She received the suspension announcement on a second-hand terminal Orvith had routed through 3 relays to her location, and she read it twice, and she sat with it. She thought about what her mother would have said. She thought she knew, actually. She thought her mother would have said, "It's a start." In exactly that voice, not small, not hedged, not resigned, but practical, the voice of someone marking a point on a map rather than announcing the destination. "It's a start. Now we go from here." Kaylura had not heard her mother's voice in 4 months. She had the shape of it in her memory, the register, the particular weight it gave to certain words, the grinding song rhythm underneath when she was thinking hard. She held it there, in the specific archive that didn't require a data wafer or an access node, the one that nobody could pull a security warrant for. She thought, "I remember you." She thought, "I'm going from here." Outside, the sky was the color it turned when the atmospheric processors ran well. A clear, specific gray that the orcs in the camp had a word for. A word that meant the sky is the same as it was before we came here, and the same as it will be after, and that is the one thing they didn't bring with them, and the one thing they can't take away. She looked at it for a long time. Then she went back to work.